theology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Chelsey Youman.
Well, welcome to the Next Generation Roundtable on this beautiful Thursday afternoon. We are so grateful you are with us today, and I'm looking forward to covering a whole host of topics in the news, a diverse range of topics, I really should say, with the many contributors we have in the next 2 hours. Our first hour, we are joined by Ethan Watson. You may remember him as a Young Voices contributor, and he is a JD candidate at Arizona State University, and he brings with him a lot of horsepower, so we're thankful to have you with us today, Ethan.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Also joining us is Will Barclay. He was on our last Next Generation Roundtable, and he did just such a phenomenal job. He brings, really, I love his perspective because it's an international perspective. He hails from Canada, but he also is a parliamentary correspondent for the Western Standard, and he has an award-winning political theorist background. So thank you for being with us today, William.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be back.
I'm excited to have you with us because we're going to dive right in. Our first topic today is a publication that you wrote specifically. We're going to get your insight on more of a deep dive of what's happening in the UK when it comes to censorship and free speech rights, not just related to Christian values, but conservative values and political discrimination as well. A little bit later in the show, we'll be talking about the increase phenomenon of Muslim mayors throughout the country and some of the mayoral disputes that's bringing, specifically related to Dearborn, Michigan, which I'm sure you've heard about, the call to Muslim prayers happening across the city there. And then the next hour, you will want to stay on with us because Richard Lim and Alyssa Sonnenburg are with us, and we're going to be talking all things politics as usual. But let's go ahead and dive right in. William, you wrote a very disturbing but compelling article recently about the BBC based out of the UK. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the BBC as the broadcasting network from the UK. And recently we became aware that they were doctoring footage, which, I think we're all in American media, the way that we consume it as we consume American media, know that there are some standards here in America for there's supposed to be journalistic integrity, which is they need sources. There's some fact checking. And in my personal experience, I've had, 10 to 13 years of media experience. They might quote both sides or at least attempt to, even if the articles or the coverage is really one-sided ultimately through the way that they dialogue over the issue. I have never in my life experienced more really biased interaction with media than I have with international media. And so anytime I did a Swedish interview, I've done some interviews out of Europe with different outlets, it astounded me that there was not even so much as an attempt or pretense to have a neutral covering of the issue or a factual presentation of the issue. And so I know we think our media is bad here. We'll get into a little bit of that later, but it doesn't hold a candle to what the BBC did, does it, William?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, as we've all recently come to learn, the BBC intentionally altered and broadcast a fundamentally misleading video of President Trump, very much in an effort to promote the false narrative that Trump attempted to incite violence in the U.S. Capitol and catalyze the infamous January 6 riots in Washington. The big problem, though, is that the BBC's campaign of disinformation against President Trump and the right wing of the political spectrum, well, it's not at all an isolated incident or even uncommon in the U.K. Rather, all right-wing politics and conservative values, well, they become openly attacked and oppressed in the UK as a result of the hyper-left-wing ideology and the fascist politics that currently dominate British society. We've seen all right-wing political discourse and commentary become relentlessly censored and oppressed. I think it's 30 people a day right now are being arrested in the UK for petty offenses like retweets and cartoons. And conservatives in the UK are routinely precluded from fundamental human rights such as freedom of religion, free speech, and political assembly. Moreover, right-wing political actors are severely persecuted and oppressed in the UK. For instance, we have Graham Linehan, an Irish writer and a critic of the hyper-liberal ideology that currently dominates the UK government. Well, he was confronted by 5 armed guards at London Heathrow Airport and arrested for inciting violence, only because on Twitter or X he was openly critical of so-called trans-identified males in female-only spaces. And finally, the left-wing politicians that dominate the UK, well, they've shamelessly abused the UK's laws and fundamental democratic processes in an effort to extinguish right-wing ideology and politics throughout the United Kingdom. For example, Christian ideology and conservative religious discourse has been openly persecuted. In 2023 alone, actually, the UK government leveraged warped interpretations of vague laws that criminalize things like annoyance and anxiety in order to wrongfully arrest over 12,000 innocent people. America's own Department of State recently condemned the UK and explicitly confirmed that the UK's persecution of silent prayer represents not only an egregious violation of the fundamental right to free speech and religious liberty, but also a concerning departure from the shared values that ought to underpin the shared U.S.-UK relations. And so, as we can all unfortunately see, all right-wing politics and conservative values, the Christian religion itself, will have all become openly attacked and oppressed in the UK. We've really seen that wool of populism trotted out and invoked once again in order to justify real horrors, unfortunately.
You have said it so well. This article is incredible. It's on pointofview.net if you want to go look at that and read it and really unpack this for yourselves. Ethan, I want to break apart a little bit of what William is describing. You know, really the first instance being what I don't know why it surprised me. I'm not sure if it surprised you, Ethan, but a full video was doctored of President Trump. He was speaking at the January 6th rally. We are all familiar with the outcome of that. But during the rally, he was giving a speech before you'll call them protesters, I guess is what I'll call them. The protesters at that time it was supposed to be a rally. And then they moved from the rally location and walked down to the Capitol, which is where, this so-called insurrection and all that happened. But during the rally, the video that BBC put up is a quote of President Trump saying, "We're going to go down to the Capitol and fight, fight, fight." But in reality, what President Trump said, the real video footage came out. He said, "We're going to go down," and really it was just going to be like a continuation of the rally to try to get the Senate not to do the vote. So, Ethan, did that surprise you to see just the openly doctored video come out of BBC?
Yeah, it did. And at this point, I'm not really surprised by the media sort of twisting the president's words or other conservatives' words. I mean, we all remember the bloodbath quote when he was referring to the auto industry, not threatening actual violence. I mean, these sort of quotes taken out of context are commonplace in the legacy media, especially. But this is just so heavy-handed that it's really sobering. Yeah. And I think William's piece does a great job just sort of recapping all of the authoritarian measures going on in the UK. It's easy for us to forget as Americans what's going on with our evil little brother across the pond. But I think this is surprising because it's so heavy-handed and so blatant, and it's really a reminder that the United States of America is truly the last bastion of the West. Australia, we saw with their draconian COVID measures, has fallen. Germany has fallen largely. The UK, which we inherited our legal system from them. I'm studying that right now, the British common law. They have largely fallen in their support for sort of Enlightenment values and Western values. And so it really is up to us here in the United States of America to preserve the West. And that's why it's so important for conservatives here, especially conservatives that are young like us, to fight like hell, like President Trump said.
Well said. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Last Tuesday, the Supreme Court decided not to revisit its previous decision that legalized same-sex marriage. Although there was a suggestion by Justice Clarence Thomas that the justices should reconsider past rulings about same-sex relationships in same-sex marriage, few believe that would occur. The case that the court rejected was an appeal from Kim Davis, a former Kentucky county clerk who did not want to issue same-sex marriage licenses. As you may remember, she was found in contempt and spent a few days in jail. The fact that she was fired was a preview of what was to come. There was no religious accommodation for her religious beliefs. One day she was issuing licenses based on thousands of years of history that define marriage as one man and one woman. Then 5 Supreme Court justices, as described by Chief Justice John Roberts, ordered every state to change their definition of marriage. We were told at the time that all gay couples wanted was equality. Many drove around with a bumper sticker with an equal sign. We quickly learned that there was no live and let live philosophy after the Supreme Court decision, and we quickly learned that once you can redefine marriage, you can also redefine gender and promote transgender rights. There are many good secular and biblical reasons not to have legalized same-sex marriage, but it is the law of the land now. It's doubtful that Supreme Court decision will be reversed anytime soon. That is why I wrote the booklet on a biblical view on same-sex marriage, so that you will have something to teach your children and grandchildren who are growing up in a society affirming same-sex marriage. The first step would be to teach what the Bible teaches about marriage and what Jesus taught about marriage. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Next Generation Roundtable today. I have Ethan Watson and William Barclay, and we're discussing a really compelling article that William wrote about not just how extreme the media is misleading, openly lying to Europeans, and specifically in this instance, BBC to UK citizens about American politics, but the broader implications of it, which when they doctored the video of President Trump, it's really culminating in other avenues of censorship. And so, as William so thoughtfully laid out, there are over 30 arrests a day right now in the UK. I would be curious to see how that compares with arrests for crime, theft, really important public interest in safety type arrests. But instead, they're arresting people who are retweeting things that others find, as he mentions, an annoyance or anxiety inducing or offensive. And the overall point of this, Ethan, I think that's worth noting is when you combine these two efforts, the censorship plus the actual misleading propaganda, what you have is what I would call a post-reality that has been created, where what is true is completely subjective. It's hard and impossible to find in the world of AI. Once a false article comes out, somebody who goes onto Google is maybe not lazy on purpose, but just assuming that the AI robot on Google is telling them the truth, finds the false information, regurgitates it. I mean, we no longer have a sense of truth or justice, what's real, what's false. And the danger in that is a lost generation having authentic discussions and being able to do what we're doing on the show right now, Ethan, which is talk about what's going on, maybe disagree, maybe have artful debate, and ultimately have logical conclusions that we're able to reach, let alone it completely fails to allow the dissemination of the gospel in the UK. We have at Alliance Defending Freedom, the nonprofit I work for now, our head of office at the UK said that the Bible app is no longer working for them. The Bible app, which means the only way to access the Bible is to make sure you go get a printed copy. And I would encourage everybody to do that right now. But this is the level of censorship that is really being compounded very quickly in expedited fashion all across Europe and the world. And it makes me very grateful for our First Amendment, which I should mention as an attorney, that the rest of the world doesn't have the same freedom of speech, freedom of media, religious liberty protections that we have. So, Ethan, I'd love any of your final thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, Chelsey, I think you highlighted it perfectly. The First Amendment is one of the many reasons why America is exceptional and why people want to come here, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later. But I really want to go back to your point about how this sort of censorship regime and combined with doctored clips and misinformation, it really goes back to the tendency of the population these days to be emotional. We're susceptible to knee-jerk emotional reactions. So people see that clip of President Trump and they think, oh, look at that fascist. or, they see some other misquoted language from a conservative anywhere in the media, and they say, oh, look at that racist, look at that fascist. And then they just immediately shut down. It's a thought-ending phrase. We've lost our attention span and our ability to sit down and digest information objectively and then form what our emotions ought to be around it. And I've seen a shocking amount of that among people at the law school, celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk and saying, well, he's a fascist. And if you try to say, well, what did he do that was fascist? They'll just say, well, you're a fascist too, and we're going to try to shut you down. Like, that's just, it's this brainworm that has gotten into people across the West. And I think the UK is just, a glimpse into our future unless we really, really combat that with free and open dialogue like we're having on this show. And I would just encourage young people out there, whether you're, in the workplace or on a college campus somewhere or in high school, don't back down from these conversations. Don't let people shut you down when they throw these terms at you. Press them respectfully but earnestly, and really try to pierce that veil of emotional knee-jerk reactions, because it's creating this censorship regime we've seen in the UK.
It's true. And this is not really an anomaly. I think that if they can't censor us, they bully us, right, as believers. So in American landscape, maybe they don't have, the government and doesn't have the right to censor us and openly facially discriminate against us for viewpoints they don't like. Instead, they engage the private sector, who has the right to cancel. We had the rise of cancel culture really being epitomized in President Trump's first electoral run. Cancel culture, public doxing, people losing jobs. The private sector really steps into the censorship regime. And I want to really highlight that, William. I know that wasn't a part of your article per se, but this idea, we at Alliance Defending Freedom call it the industrial censorship complex, because you have a lot of actors here. There's state actors, government actors, there's the media actors, which I think we're all most familiar with. But you also have corporate actors, and that is debanking. Let's think of it in terms of debanking, where Christians and believers get bumped from their banks. Microsoft wouldn't give my last organization rights to utilize its features, or upsold us on everything. Salesforce, canceling subscriptions of believers. Across the world, you've got people being fired for their belief systems as believers and Christians, let alone conservative values. And so this private industrial censorship complex is something I want to flag for all of you listening today to push against, because we as consumers, there is a power and an authority to us as consumers to say we're going to choose to use products, we're going to choose to use platforms outside of these mainstream censorship regimes, instead of, finding real news outlets like Point of View, for instance, is a great way to put your time and energy, but also, alternative web browsers, finding products, Patriot, getting your meat from the Patriot Company and different places like that. William, I'm not sure if you've thought much about the private censorship complex, but I wanted to flag that as an extension of, what we're more familiar with these bigger industries.
No, absolutely. It sounds like something that's happening over in Germany, actually. In Berlin, I don't know if you all are familiar with Douglas Murray, but it's impossible to buy his books simply because he's being branded as a right-wing extremist. And so his works have actually been banned throughout Germany, Berlin, all the cities there. And I think it's really just very much an extension, like we've all been saying, of the fact that we have political figures like in Europe, France's president, Emmanuel Macron. He's repeatedly claimed that populism is spreading across Europe like a disease, and that Europeans should fight populists vigorously instead of criticizing the actions of pro-European governments like his, right? And so when you have the politicians cultivating this culture amongst the society and citizens, and then incentivizing, like you're saying, kind of the industrial persecution of conservatives, well, I think it's really only the logical conclusion that again, you have this ghoul of populism being trotted out, not just in the political sphere, but in the industrial complex, to kind of frighten and shame people away from that right wing of the political spectrum and back over towards the left. I think it's in a lot of ways really the only recourse they have left because of the inanity, the nonsensical nature of a lot of the stuff they're proposing nowadays.
Yes, it's definitely something that we all want to be aware of, but it's also one we want to engage in. And again, as you work in your business and your corporate life, to continue to make our Christian belief systems normalized, right? Continue to speak truth in love. Continue to say that we will not be silenced. We will, with courage, with strength, and with grace, continue to speak truth, and that no amount of intimidation, no amount of censorship is going to be left unanswered. And that's what, so many of our brothers and sisters around the world are doing, because downstream of the censorship, is what we're really seeing in parts of the world, in Africa, specifically is what I'm alluding to, where, churches are being burned down and Christians are being martyred. And so just continuing to press against this and say, we're not going to normalize the disenfranchisement of our Christian belief systems and values. There's nothing more important than that. And this dovetails really neatly with our next topic, which is while, the Christian values and belief systems are being marginalized and silenced worldwide, another belief system is actually being increased and is being allowed to be prosperous. And that belief system is Islam. And to say, in these very regions where Christendom, I do not think that it is an irony or a coincidence that in these very regions where Christendom is being pressed to the outer, you're being arrested for your Christian values and beliefs, that Islam is on the rise. And that not only is Islam on the rise from a population standpoint because of migration, but elected officials who are Muslim are being elected, which, from my more objective policy standpoint, there's nothing wrong with a whole host of interfaiths, interacting and engaging in the political realm, being elected. There is a problem when it starts to do what's happening in the UK with Christians, and pushing them out of that public sphere. So our next topic, which you can read on pointofview.net, is going to be talking about what's happening in Dearborn, Michigan. You're going to want to hear this, so don't go anywhere.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kirby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Chelsey Youman.
Well, welcome back to the Next Generation Roundtable. I've got Ethan Watson and William Barclay with me, and we are discussing really what is a trend, unfortunately, of, a decrease in, it's really that tolerance is a one-way street, which is nothing new, I think, to our experience here in America in at least the last decade, if not longer, where Christian values and belief systems are being pushed from the public sphere, both by government entities in Europe, which we just discussed, if you want to go back and listen to the beginning of our hour, or in the private sector. And the simultaneous shift that we're also seeing is an increase in tolerance for other belief systems like Islam. And we discussed how we're having more Muslim mayors elected across our country, and of course elected officials internationally as well. And while in and of itself, I would posit to us that there's nothing wrong in as hegemonious as a society as we are. We have a multifaceted, multicultural, multi-religious society, for elected officials to represent their constituents. That's not really the issue. What is the issue is when you start to see those platforms and positions of power being utilized to be intolerant towards Christian belief systems and values. That should be a two-way street. Unfortunately, it's not. And what's happening in Dearborn is mosques across the city have been allowed by the city council for what this article says now is 2 years. At least one witness has said to do morning calls to prayers, sometimes starting as early as 5:30 in the morning. Now, I'm a religious liberty attorney, so I'm going to be the first to say that, churches should, under RLUIPA and our religious liberty laws, are allowed to practice and function. That's not the issue. The issue here is that the calls to prayer are far exceeding the ordinance sound limits. Okay, so the sound limits, it's at night. It's not supposed to really get beyond 55 decibels. And at least one resident has said that before the city council that when she records the prayers, it exceeds 70 decibels. And, the city has had many meetings about this where residents are coming up and saying, look, we're Christians. We want equal religious liberty across the city, but these are too loud. The calls to prayer are too loud, and they're disturbing us. And we're Christians and want to see equal treatment as Christians in Dearborn. And the mayor, who is Muslim, his name is Hamoud. He says this isn't a problem and has continued to ignore the complaints of his citizens about this. Now, there's a lot of ways for us to unpack this. I don't think this is a linear issue, as I mentioned, as from a religious liberty standpoint. But William, I'd love to just get your take and thoughts really from the legal side or just, the cultural side of the implications of something like allowing very, very loud Muslim calls to prayer outside of the legal limits in the city, what they call for. That's really a wild thing to me to see this happen.
Oh, absolutely. I think that what we're seeing is a huge violation of democracy's fundamental tenets, literally the erosion and erasure in order to make room for this concept of abject diversity in real time. And it really just demonstrates a lot of either the ignorance or the disregard for the cornerstone of any democracy, our fundamental liberties and human rights that's just become endemic on the left. They've simply rejected the fact that in any democracy, your beliefs can't infringe upon my autonomy, my humanity, my human rights. I mean, one of the fundamental premises of any democracy is you have to leave as good enough and as good, I think John Locke says, really allow the space for everyone to exercise their own rights. It's one of the fundamental premises of any democracy. And just as a quick example, if I buy a house, I can't somehow preclude you from your ability to also purchase a house one day. And actually, what's funny to me is we've heard all this talk of this uneasy alliance between Islamic extremists and left-wing radicals, communists, but it's not an uneasy or tense alliance at all. It's really quite an intimate relationship, and they're happy bedmates. They share a ton of ideological similarities. They're more similar, in fact, than not. They both espouse a rigid gender ideology and impose it on all and sundry. Fundamental human rights like free speech and freedom of belief mean nothing to them, and violence is ultimately the answer to any disagreement with their dogma. And I do also absolutely think that this is all part of a much larger campaign of anti-Christian persecution that we've seen become the norm over the past decade, not just in America, but really everywhere. Canada, South Korea. I really encourage you to check what's happening in South Korea. It's awful. Just the other day, we were all discussing, like you're saying, the extermination of Christians in Nigeria and the media's utter silence on the matter. And I think it was Bill Maher actually said something effective, no Jews, no news. But in my opinion, the media is being silent not because of there's no Jews, but because the genocide of Christians in Nigeria, Sudan, it does involve and implicate black Muslim terrorists exterminating Christians. And so the media can't spin it in any way to fit their agenda of identity politics and the subtle abuse of white people that has become not just tolerated but encouraged by the left over the course of the past decade. I think when Irina Zaruka was slayed, Black Lives Matter itself explicitly stated black people have a right to violence against white people. And that's just grotesque.
You're really hitting in on some things here and I want to talk about this, Ethan. The first thing William said, which was so really astute, is this alliance between, we would say Muslim sympathizers, Palestinians, and Muslims themselves, and the liberal left. Because on the face, this was something that's hard for me to wrap my own head around. I would think their values are completely unaligned. When you have the left who, adheres very strongly to no amount of gender norms or traditional marriage or family, and you've got Muslim countries who would, murder someone for transitioning or doing it. I think at first blush, those two don't align. But when you unpack it like William did, Ethan, I'd love more of in depth from you on that as well. They are rather rigid. They are rather militant. They are really radical in their views. They both treat their ideologies like a religion. And I think they're both using each other during this moment. And they cry Islamophobia, almost like, at the same time, they're deeply anti-Semitic in many respects. And we're seeing anti-Semitism on the rise in both parties, by the way. But they cry Islamophobia. And in the case of Dearborn, they're saying all these Christians coming to the city council meetings and testifying are anti-Muslim. But the truth is, that I think they're using that as a cloak or a veil to allow them to continue to mistreat and marginalize Christians. So, Ethan, what do you think about this alliance between Muslims and liberals, when I would think that their values, Muslim values, should be at least Americanized or Westernized Muslim values, are pretty pro-family, anti-abortion? You would think they're a little bit more conservative.
Yeah, at first blush, it does look that way. But let's think about what leftism looks like today. Leftism defines itself in opposition to Western values: nuclear family, capitalism, traditional gender roles, Christianity. Right? Leftism seeks the destruction of all of those systems. Islam, while it shares some facets of, maybe nuclear family structure and things like that, it's not conservative in the sense that it wants to conserve the West. In fact, Islam has always been about conquering, dominating, and destroying the West, going back to the Ottoman Turks invading the Holy Land, going back to the Moorish invasion of Spain, going back to what we've seen, in the last 10, 15 years in the UK and in Europe. So, across the board, Islam has really been defined in its opposition to the West, which is the same as the American left. And I think your point about religious liberty is important because, on the one hand, yes, we want people to be able to practice their religion as they see fit. Now, in the same vein, I think this Dearborn case really highlights that not every culture or religion is compatible to live next door to one another. And I think maybe we need to at least have a conversation about, okay, well, what's within our Overton window of acceptability here? And it'd be different if I felt like the Muslim migrants, especially to the upper Midwest, were seeking to assimilate and become a part of America, but they're carving out their own ethnic enclaves, governed not by American cultural tradition, which is what has made this country great, but by their own cultural tradition. That's why Somali tribal conflict decided the Minneapolis mayoral race, strange and almost, hilarious turn of events if it wasn't real. And so I think I don't really have a good answer for it this time, but I think we need to have at least a conversation about whether all religious traditions can exist in a tolerant system or whether we're faced with a little bit of a suicidal empathy here as Westerners.
That's a really important nuance, I think, to point out as well, and to differentiate between, American citizens, Americans, or those who migrate and, like you said, assimilate and want to engage as civic civilians in our country, in our culture, and adhere to their Muslim faith faithfully. And I grew up with a lot of friends like that, and so I do want to say that this isn't to paint with too broad of brushstrokes because there, as in any group of people or belief system or ideology, there's divergences. But what we're talking about here is a category of those who aren't assimilating and expecting those around them who are doing their calls to prayer in traffic, stopping traffic, not assimilating. There's a differentiation there. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back right after this break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Next Generation Roundtable today. We are so excited to be with you and rounding out our first hour with, we've had an incredible hour of conversation with Ethan and William here. So go back and listen. Don't forget to go to pointofview.net and read our topics today and more. And also you can like us and comment on Facebook. We love to hear from you. I'm going to entitle this next segment, and if you like it, I might make it a reoccurring segment, How to Talk to a Liberal. And I think that this is something that's near and dear to my heart because I think we can really find common ground by continuing to engage even in difficult dialogue with our friends on the other side, with family members. We all have Thanksgiving coming up next week. Everybody's probably got a crazy millennial liberal niece or nephew or cousin they're going to engage with. And so I think it's important to first continue having discussions if it's a good environment and really a fruitful conversation. But then comes the question, how to best do that? How do we kind of cut through the noise and sometimes the logical disconnects that are thrown our way, or even sometimes I would call it like gaslighting is a good millennial term to put on it. And instead just get to the heart of the issues. That's something that really Charlie Kirk was the heart and soul of his ministry, was founded upon that. And I think if you've watched as many videos as I have of his debates, more since he passed than I could say I'd watched in the years before combined, was really this idea of continuing to talk to each other continues to humanize each other as brothers and sisters, right? And one, I think, example of maybe how to avoid some pitfalls in how to talk to a liberal came from, of all people, Sydney Sweeney this week. If you don't know her, and I must admit, I don't really follow her or know much about who she is. I think she's an influencer. She is the model who did the jeans campaign that was so heavily criticized on the left. And they came out saying all kinds of horrible things about her because the jeans, they did a play on the phrase good jeans. And because she is white and, blonde, essentially they said that was, really insensitive. And so she had an interview this week on Newsweek, and she handled it flawlessly. And it's a great example of how to handle some of the accusations that come against people from the liberals. So basically, she was asked directly by the journalist, the criticism of the content, her campaign, her Jean campaign, which is maybe specifically in this political climate, white people shouldn't joke about genetic superiority. Like that was the criticism, broadly speaking. And since you're talking about this, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about that specifically. What this was just blatantly trying to bait her into admitting that she's some type of white supremacist. And Sydney Sweeney responded perfectly. She said, when I have an issue that I want to speak about, people will hear. She just shut it down. She didn't play into it. She didn't get sucked into a debate. I just wanted to do an ad campaign. I thought she handled it really well. So I'll start with you, William. What stood out to you about how she handled this and ways that we can learn maybe to avoid accepting premises in a debate that really get us sidetracked from issues that matter? I would say as an example is this journalist automatically said, that the political climate is against her. Well, that's a premise that I would not accept, or that that somehow her ad campaign was in fact about genetic superiority when that's not really what it was about. It was a play. And so instead of her debating each of those premises, she just said, I'm not going to go there. What did you think about her response, William?
I thought that it was remarkably astute. I think that she recognized that it's almost an unwinnable debate for her in this modern climate, simply because identities rather than actions have become wrong, right? And so there's really nothing she can do in order to rescue her perspective in any way with kind of the leftist interviewer. And I think what's funny is you could certainly say there's an inter-ethnic hatred and violence and how plagues or pounds in America, but it's squarely a consequence of the left and their open fetishization of diversity and their flirtations with identity politics throughout the modern era, I think in a lot of ways what we've seen is that white people will now, their only real function to the left is guilt and to be a mouthpiece that regurgitates this narrative of white oppression. I think that in a lot of ways, the modern gospel of identity politics and its intersectional apostles, they've decreed that anyone who's sufficiently undiverse or white, well, they're not merely incapable of any socio-political suffering, but they're actually themselves the source of all socio-political malaise and a locus of oppression themselves. And what we've seen, I think, is that on the back of this in America, it's become completely legitimate and even subtly encouraged to abuse and persecute white people in America. Anyone, in fact, who doesn't immediately and apparently display the appropriate diversity criteria, let's say. And I think we've seen this become pretty much commonplace in America and elsewhere. But I think very much America is kind of the example we want to look to for minorities or people who are sufficiently diverse, such as black women or trans individuals. Well, they've become able to openly abuse and attack white people in America and commit explicit hate crimes without any consequence. I mean, I think, again, I go back to the Ruthven murder. I think it's the perfect example, and it really vividly underscores one of modern America's most macabre truths. Really, any white person can actually be freely persecuted, even murdered in America, and nothing but silence will echo out.
Well, you're raising so much of the depth of what's behind these ideas, wokeism, DEI ideas, but at their depth and core, it is about division. It's about continued inequality in a different way. And ultimately, it stood out to me, Ethan, that the journalist asking this was white and obviously had contempt for Sydney throughout the interview, which is, I think, common in the media. And I think common too among liberals to say, they're just going to assume kind of the worst in each other. And I've noticed that with some of my friends who are liberal. There's no real grace about it. We're not assuming that Sydney Sweeney just thought this was a great ad campaign, wanted to do her job and do it well. Instead, we're assuming, we're demonizing, right? And so for us, when we're interacting with our liberal friends, to say, hey, don't forget, I'm a real person. I don't have to fear being canceled anymore. I'm not worried about all these accusations you're saying, but I do want to talk about really more important things here. What did you think, Ethan?
Yeah, I think Sydney Sweeney is, a master at handling these kind of questions, and she's done a great job. I think, first of all, what you said is important about building that connection, that human connection beyond the demonization. And I'm not saying you need to go kowtow and bend the knee and say, oh, please view me as a human because I'm an evil Republican or something. I don't think that's appropriate. But what I do think you should do, and this is what I've done coming here, and I'm on the board for just about every conservative organization I could find at ASU Law. And I'm still hanging out with the Democrat lawyers exec board for Friendsgiving on Sunday. And the reason why I'm able to do that is because before I even talked politics with people, I was just a normal, decent person. We talked football, we talked classes, we shared notes, right? Building that sort of social fabric with people gives you a lot of leeway in their mind. They might try to cancel someone else, but they won't cancel you, and they'll listen to you if you have something to say. So the number one rule of politics, and really the number one rule in life, is don't be weird. Don't be a lightning rod for controversy if you can avoid it, right? Just be a normal, personable person, and you're going to turn so many people to your side if you can just manage that. But when the ridiculous racism allegations come, or we had an event a couple of weeks ago where people were saying, oh, I feel unsafe because there's a pro-life speaker on campus. The thing you shouldn't do is get down to the weeds and say, oh, no, here's why we're not making you feel unsafe, or here's why I'm not a racist. Once you engage in that argument, you're wrong-footed and you look bad. So what you should do when you hear those kind of ad hominem attacks is just laugh. Say, you people are ridiculous. You do not feel unsafe. I'm not a racist. Literally, this is absurd. I'm not even going to address it. And then calmly move on with your day. You will look strong and confident, and they will look hysterical and weak. And that is a winning argument, not because you will win them over, but because the third parties, the bystanders, the undecided and independents, they will see that, and you will look like the better side of that interaction. So that's my two sides. It's like the carrot and the stick, basically.
Well said. You heard it here. How to talk to a liberal. Don't be weird. I think you guys did an excellent job this last hour. Thank you, Ethan, for being with us, and William Barclay. You can go to pointofview.net. Follow them on Twitter. Their links are right there. Don't go anywhere. We have another hour.
Can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now. Or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Chelsey Youman.
Well, welcome to the Next Generation Roundtable today. I am so excited to be with you and continuing our second hour of the Next Generation Roundtable. So if you were not with us last hour, please go back and listen. Ethan Watson and Will Barclay were with us, and we talked about a whole host of free speech issues. But we are turning now to add new panelists to the discussion. We've got Richard Lim. You know him as no stranger to the show. He is the head of the This American President podcast, and he has been in many appearances. He's also a historian. So we're glad you're with us, Richard. Thanks for being here today.
Great to be here, Chelsey.
We're going to have such a good discussion because you sent me some articles I cannot wait politically to break down with you. But before we get there, Alyssa Sonnenburg is also with us today. She is an executive assistant to the director of the Illinois Family Institute. So she's involved in politics there. She's a host, writer, and manager of the Self-Evident podcast. Thanks for being with us today, Alyssa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we are going to start today our topic really about the Epstein files, which I know is getting covered, but we want to summarize it. I think I want to break it down. We don't talk about it as often on the show as it is in the news cycle, and I think it's a really important thing for us to highlight now that there's some traction and momentum there on the release of those files. We're also going to talk a little bit later in the show about Vice President J.D. Vance and maybe some unique opportunity he has as a potential Republican candidate. And then we'll end the show talking about a development in a lab that I need someone to explain to me like I'm a 3-year-old, but it's really worth talking about because it's a computer run on human cells. You heard that right, human cells. So we will be talking about that. It's not out of a sci-fi movie. It's actually from AI News. But we're going to start with the Epstein files. There are several major developments happening. You know, I'm going to start at a high level. Alyssa, for me, I love that 15 years after Epstein was thrown into prison and 5 years after his death, this is still in the headlines. I think it's really indicative of a united public sentiment that Americans don't like pedophiles. They don't want to tolerate criminals. And no matter how much the establishment, I'm starting really strong here, on either side, Democrat or Republican, continues to try to bury the lead, bury the list, who went to the island when, what were they doing. The American public is not having it. And I think the media is helping keep this story alive. Right now, it's politically expedient for a liberal media base to make Trump the scapegoat for this. But let's not forget, President Biden didn't release it either. And so we have both sides to blame. But the point is, for me, I think culturally speaking, that it is just so deeply unpopular that it's something that's uniting Americans on either side of the aisle, that they want there to be accountability for this elite class of criminals. And secondly, that because of that pressure, and we have Republicans headed into the midterms, which, traditionally after a big win is going to be a harder year for them, they're starting to split from the MAGA Republican, President Trump saying, I'm not going to release these and applying pressure. Now they're starting to say, wait, I've got to go win my district. And this is so deeply unpopular. We're going to do something about it. Alyssa, I would love to get your take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially as a mom now, the pressure I feel that we as Americans deserve to know who is involved and was involved in Epstein's Island is paramount to importance, I believe, that Americans deserve transparency. And to your point, Chelsey, I think it's really beautiful that as much as some of the mainstream media likes to push this idea that everyone is okay with, kids being targeted with sexual identity politics in schools, in their public schools that they're dealing with, that most people, most Americans have this innate sense to protect children. And this extends obviously to the realm of pedophilia, that as much as different sects of transgender ideology wants to normalize pedophilia and say that it's a normal attraction to a minor, that's what they want to call it now, that most people are not like that. And so I think it's just really great to see that on both sides of the aisle, this is a moment where we can come together and unify under one idea of having these files released.
I do too. And Richard, I'd love to get your take on this as well, because in my estimation, this is one of the, and you can correct me on this, I'm trying to think back over the last 9 years of President Trump politically being on the scene. He was able pretty successfully as a politician, as a communicator, to really shut down in a 24-hour media cycle and really survive. I mean, nothing they threw at him really stuck. And there were a lot of hard things thrown at him, lots of names, lots of scandal, and he survived it all, even to the point, I believe he was quoted as saying he could walk down the street and shoot somebody and nothing would happen to him because he was so untouchable and politically successful in the midst and in spite of those things. And I think this is the first time he has not been able to get out of having to deal with the scandal. And it's not that he's been implicated. I want to be really careful here because 20,000 emails were released from the House Oversight Committee, and there was no smoking gun there for President Trump. There have been witnesses saying, he was in the same elite New York circles. They attended the same events, maybe even were friends, but there hasn't been an allegation that I'm aware of explicitly against President Trump. So I'm not saying he's implicated in the crimes. What I am saying is he's wanted this to go away and it hasn't. And that's really the first scandal I can think of for him that's continued to be a problem even among his own base, Richard.
Yeah, and I think he and a number of people in his administration kind of fanned the flames on this, implying that, hey, there's a lot out there. But then when the time has come to release all of this, he basically kind of backtracked or wanted to move on. But people have legitimate reasons for wanting to know what really happened. And I think especially as Christians, I've been thinking about just biblically how to look at this situation. And we know from Scripture that nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest. And we should support full truth and transparency because truth matters, but also because there have been so many victims. There are victims that remain a priority, that deserve justice. We know Scripture also tells us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And there are people that have been victimized by this that need to be vindicated, in terms of what happened and who the perpetrators are. And so I think that this is one thing that does speak well to Americans' sense of justice. And as Christians, we need to be really on the front lines of that, wanting what the full truth is. With that said, we should also be prudent about it because oftentimes when a number of files are released, there can be innocent people that kind of get caught up in what's happening. And so we need to keep the focus on justice rather than on the partisanship and the feuds, on justice being done and for people who are innocent to be exonerated and people who are guilty to be exposed.
Well said. I'm so glad you brought that home, Richard, for us to really focus on the point of all of this, which is American people don't want anyone to be above the law, and don't want to see victims continuing. Ostensibly, these criminals, they're still out there, right? They could be still perpetuating these crimes just in different ways now that the island is shut down, but that's not to say there aren't mass amounts of justice that has not been rendered, and people let go. And we're gonna continue on this one when we get back after this break. So don't go anywhere.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Last Tuesday, the Supreme Court decided not to revisit its previous decision that legalized same-sex marriage. Although there was a suggestion by Justice Clarence Thomas that the justices should reconsider past rulings about same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage, few believe that would occur. The case that the court rejected was an appeal from Kim Davis, a former Kentucky county clerk who did not want to issue same-sex marriage licenses. As you may remember, she was found in contempt and spent a few days in jail. The fact that she was fired was a preview of what was to come. There was no religious accommodation for her religious beliefs. One day she was issuing licenses based on thousands of years of history that define marriage as one man and one woman. Then 5 Supreme Court justices, as described by Chief Justice John Roberts, ordered every state to change their definition of marriage. We were told at the time that all gay couples wanted was equality. Many drove around with a bumper sticker with an equal sign. We quickly learned that there was no live and let live philosophy after the Supreme Court decision, and we quickly learned that once you can redefine marriage, you can also redefine gender and promote transgender rights. There are many good secular and biblical reasons not to have legalized same-sex marriage, but it is the law of the land now. It's doubtful that Supreme Court decision will be reversed anytime soon. That is why I wrote the booklet on a biblical view on same-sex marriage, so that you will have something to teach your children and grandchildren who are growing up in a society affirming same-sex marriage. The first step would be to teach what the Bible teaches about marriage and what Jesus taught about marriage. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Next Generation Roundtable on this Thursday afternoon. We are discussing the congressional act to have the Epstein files released, and we're calling them Epstein files. We know that there's, really emails which include names of both victims, but also, colleagues, friends, interactions with Jeffrey Epstein. And I wanted to just give a little bit of background here. What's happening is a unanimous vote by the Senate to have the DOJ release all of the files unredacted, and a House vote as well. And I think it was a week ago, President Trump, said that this wasn't going to happen. And then now he's saying, okay, I'll sign it, that it looks like it will go through as a part of a bipartisan effort to get clarity on who all was involved in some of these schemes. Although, association is not necessarily enough for an indictment or implication. I think that these elite circles in New York, it looks like were really incestuous. Everybody was at these events. But the bigger point here, I think, Richard, I thought I wanted to tease out for us is that this should not really require a congressional act. In fact, I think it's going to be sloppier because it's a congressional act. The DOJ is under the purview of President Trump as the chief executive officer. And so what he could do is wave a magic wand and have redacted versions of these documents that protect victims from being further victimized, and their names and their loved ones. He could release those, but he's not. And so, Richard, I just wanted to get your take on the process that this is going through, or just this topic in general.
Yeah, the president has declassification authority, and so the fact of the matter is that he has the ability to do that, to release it in any manner he'd want to, whether it's redacted or not. So it's one of those things where it does beg the question about, are certain people being protected, and so I think that the president really needs to understand that this is something that is fraying his coalition and fraying the Republican Party, and really needs to approach this as, I need to listen to what the people are demanding right now. And few politicians in the last decade or so have really understood what the average American, the common man, has been thinking, and that's Donald Trump. He's understood it perhaps better than anyone. He's been elected twice as president, and I hope in this case he listens and understands how important this is moving forward.
I hope you're right. That's an interesting point too. I think because he hasn't been directly implicated and no one's come forward with allegations against him on this front, when he was promising to release them throughout his campaign, that people weren't necessarily tying him as part of the scandal, but his response since has brought up questions about his involvement and the extent to which he's going to not release certain information. And maybe it's as simple as these were his friends in New York, and he had a lot of friends implicated in it. I'm not sure. Alyssa, did you have any final thoughts on the release of the Epstein files that may hopefully be imminent?
Yeah, to Richard's point, this whole situation could have gone much more smoothly, not needing Congress to be involved. And to something that you said, Chelsey, this is one of the main talking points that Trump did in his recent campaign, was talking about how the American people deserve transparency. And so for him to now be in office and to be really shuffling his feet on this, and then calling Marjorie Greene, who has had his back for years, a traitor because she wanted the release of the Epstein files, it honestly shocked me, because again, this was a talking point that he ran on, of the American people deserving truth and transparency. And so I'm really happy to see that he's shuffling back on this, that he's starting to possibly listen to his base. But yes, it does beg the question of why now that he's in office did he start to backpedal? So I think it's going to be really interesting when the files are actually released of who's implicated, and maybe then we'll get a bigger picture of what was actually going on.
Yes, and hopefully, as Richard so importantly said last segment, ultimately the DOJ is going to make some arrests. I mean, what we want is to see, these horrific offenders to be out of the public square victimizing anybody else, put in a place where they can't do that anymore. And no one should be above the law, no matter what their status or bank account says. And so I hope that ultimately is where all of these investigations are leading. We shall see. But we will turn now to an article that you can go to pointofview.net and read. And it is about, I thought it was really interesting, Richard, you sent this over, how it's entitled, How J.D. Vance Can Manage the Fractious Right. And the article makes comparisons between Vice President Vance and Richard Nixon, who demonstrated a formula for success. I liked the historical hook on this, Richard, but I also have been wondering myself about what looks to be. We know that the left, and we do talk about this, they have their own divisions, but the right can be really multifaceted. And this article talks about how, the right has divisions on foreign policy. Some are anti-interventionalist, don't want us to be involved in wars. Some are, sympathetic to Israel and want us involved in some wars. Others, we have domestic feuds between us. It even talks about, some of the louder voices in the movement, Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Candace Owens, who all are really far right. And then I really liked, Richard, how this article outlined the difference between President Trump as more of a populist president, which I'd love for you to explain that to us, that concept, and traditional Republican GOP presidents is his lack of reliance on conservative think tanks. I don't know if that's the right word, or the policy groups, the interest groups. There are conservative groups that traditionally the conservative president, leans on for expertise in various areas of the law and policy. And President Trump hasn't really done that. And so what we have now is a pretty multifaceted party for a future Republican candidate to try to coalesce around. And Richard, I'd love for you to break this down for us.
Yeah, well, one thing I just wanted to clarify, you mentioned about how certain parts of the party support Israel and are more comfortable with involvement in wars. I wanted to clarify that I would say that a number of people who don't identify as, let's say, like non-interventionists, believe that American engagement with the world is good, and they see that as a way to ward off wars. They believe that things like mutual partnerships and defense pacts and all those things with other countries can actually help deter enemies and prevent war. So I wouldn't say that they want America to get into war. They just feel like engagement is actually a better way to avoid wars in the future. Because oftentimes when America pulls out of certain regions, they descend into chaos, and then they become a threat, and America gets tempted to intervene. But anyways, with that said, yes, it was a very interesting article, and I think it highlights the fact that divisions within the GOP are nothing new. I think if you look at, prior to the Reagan era, you had a time when you had the moderate Republicans led by Nelson Rockefeller, and then you had the conservatives led by Goldwater, and then you had Nixon, who kind of straddled both sides. And the Republicans were still able to have great success during that time, even during Reagan. The Reagan-Bush administration was actually divided right down the middle because a lot of Reaganites didn't like the Bush people and vice versa. And so divisions are nothing new. They come with political coalitions. I think as Christians, we understand that you have to work with people you don't always agree with in a fallen world for a common goal. But, of course, the key is to maintain cohesion in that base, and that is J.D. Vance's challenge. It is holding on to that base, which right now consists of the working class as well as the conservatives within the party. And so I think that it's really going to take somebody who's able to communicate that well. And for Republicans, it's always been about keeping that base happy. Republican presidents tend to do well when they keep the base happy. That's what Reagan did. That's what George W. Bush was able to do to some extent in 1-2 terms. But other people like George H.W. Bush wasn't able to do that because he essentially abandoned what was then the kind of the Reaganite base. So right now we have a base that's in flux with the working class, and we have yet to see if Vance can keep that while keeping conservatives. But I think he's got a leg up on it because the other thing he has to do is to keep Trump happy. As long as his relationship with Trump is good, his relationship with Trump's base will be good.
You raised so many points, and when we get back from a break, Alyssa, I'll turn to you on this. But I would say, Richard, in my estimation, the Republican Party it's undergone significant changes under President Trump's leadership. I would say a much more libertarian bent than true conservatism. In that, think of social issues. Many of the Republican Party platforms on social issues, conservative issues, were changed or revised, and that's going to be an interesting turn of events to see where Vice President Vance goes from there. Don't go anywhere after this short break.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never yield to force. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Chelsey Youman.
Well, welcome back to the Next Generation Roundtable. I am joined today by Richard Lim and Alyssa Sonnenburg, and we're talking about really potential. We're looking at the stream at midterms, but also the potential future of the Republican Party and the opportunity that Vice President Vance has to unite it, even though there are, of course, as always, many factions within. And so we're turning to you, Alyssa, now just to get your take on this article. We've got it posted on pointofview.net, by the way, so you can go read this topic or many more that we've discussed today. And you can like us on Facebook at Point of View Radio on Facebook. But Alyssa, we were discussing really some, I think, incredible changes to vast changes, more than incredible, to the Republican Party, including in the platforms under President Trump's leadership. Most presidents do, by the way, really, I think, direct the ship when it comes to what the party represents or doesn't. So that's not an anomaly, but with President Trump, it was a pretty stark shift. A lot of Republican Party platforms, for instance, changed their pro-life stances over the last election cycle. Maybe didn't talk as much about traditional marriage, family, gender. Those core conservative social values have gone a little bit by the wayside when you look at this presidency and the things that they're prioritizing. I think that's safe to say, is it not, Alyssa?
Absolutely. That was exactly the direction I was going to go with this. That when I see the fracture in the Republican Party, what I see is the Republican Party is the Democrat Party 20 years ago. Look at what has just happened in the past few years. We've had the GOP completely abandon the pro-life issue. We've had Trump's FDA roll out this unsafe abortion pill for national use without proper studies being done or listening to the studies that have been done showing the harmful side effects for women of this abortion pill, and also, of course, the death of preborn children in the womb. And so what we've seen is complete abandonment of what it means to be a conservative in the first place. And Isabel Brown was recently on CNN of the Daily Wire talking about this very thing, about how young men specifically are veering away from MAGA and the Republican Party because it's not conservative enough. Again, we've seen what has happened with abortion. And also, and I know this is more controversial, we have this movement of gays for Trump. We have Trump a few years ago hosting a pride celebration at Mar-a-Lago. So we have this idea of conservatism of, I honestly don't know what we're trying to conserve. It's probably an economic way of life from what I'm seeing. But when it comes to moral issues, the Republican Party doesn't in any way represent what I believe are valuable to my family or what the Word of God says.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that we as believers are trying to find our footing in a world that has shifted considerably, not just away from our values, but from even tolerating our belief systems at all. I think we talked about that a lot the last hour. So if you want to go back and listen, please do. But this idea that, we talked about what is referred to as the censorship industrial complex. And that is, it's got many actors, but not just, state, government, media trying to censor or cancel might be another word for it, believers in our belief systems, but also the private sector. Debanking is on the rise. You've got all kinds of ways that, social media algorithms are dropping Christian content from being displayed in the algorithm. You've got 30 arrests a day in the UK for people retweeting things that are conservative or Christian. I don't like to always conflate the two, but the point being, I think there are a lot of Christian voters who want more. And I do believe, Richard, that J.D. Vance has a more conservative background. He is much more open about his faith. He's very pro-life. And I think, and I hope that given the right platform, he can come into his own. Right now he's the vice president under President Trump, and so he's got marching orders to take. But Richard, do you think there's opportunity that he'll go back to maybe some of those roots we were hoping to see a few years ago in a conservative leader?
Yeah, well, I think what Alyssa said about the Democratic Party, where the Democratic Party, let's say 20 years ago, the Republicans have kind of adopted a number of those positions. I think it's fair to say that in many ways. I don't know if I'd say that the Republicans have gotten more libertarian, because under Trump you see things like tariffs, which is very much not a libertarian position. I think they've essentially made tactical retreats on a number of issues that they feel like are battles that they feel like aren't worth fighting right now. Let's say on the abortion issue, having put justices in that have overturned Roe v. Wade, they've essentially just said, okay, this issue is at the state level. That's where it's going to be fought, becoming essentially agnostic on the issue. And I see that as a tactical retreat. I don't know if that is a retreat, like a permanent one. But with all of that said, it's interesting because the strength of the Trump movement is that it has introduced new demographics into the party. For so long, the party has talked about reaching minorities and the working class, and under Trump, that is happening. And it's leading to electoral success, but what you get with that is a lot of ideas that often can be quite contradictory. The working class was the backbone of the Democratic Party for a very long time, going back to Franklin Roosevelt, and now a lot of their views are being introduced into this party. So this is going to be one of those difficult moments where how does a party maintain that electoral success without losing fundamentally its soul, without losing what it stands for? I think J.D. Vance is an interesting person in this because he comes from the working class. That's his demographic, that's his base, but he does have conservative positions on abortion. So I think that situates him well moving forward as maintaining this working class / conservative coalition. But, you know, we'll see what happens over the next 3 years if the Trump administration is able to maintain that coalition.
It will be interesting to watch and to see, you know, the impact, how long-term or not President Trump and his leadership will ultimately have on the party. I mean, I think it's been such an interesting, for me, thing to watch. Even just the demographic shifts from the parties over the last few election cycles have been really historic. And so that's been really good to see. But we are going to move now to our final topic of the day. And this was one that is, honestly, you would think from a sci-fi movie, but it's real life. And it's so complex and interesting, but I think it's unprecedented what this topic is about. And so what I'm going to describe to you is real. Okay. This is from a bona fide interestingengineering.com website. And it describes a new type of computer, but they call it a biological computer. It's called CL1. It's based out of a lab group that came out of Australia. And in between 2 and 3 years, they took a concept and are now rolling out full biological computers as a product. And that's crazy to me. But instead of using silicone devices, it uses 800,000 lab-grown human neurons. And that means that instead of silicone devices, the neurons are coming from human skin or blood samples. And they're programming the human cells. And this is crazy to me. But the human cells also come from donated cells. And so there's real people who are donating their cells to this experimentation. And essentially what it describes is using various electrical signals to build a life support system for these real living human cells that they have to keep alive. And then they program them and say that they work faster. They're more adaptable than traditional silicone type programs, and that they use less energy. So they don't need big data centers or AI hardware. Essentially what they say in this article is the human cells are the computer's hardware. And this merging between man and machine is something, again, you would think is out of a sci-fi movie, but is extraordinary to me to be watching come to life, and has incredible ethical implications that we really need to talk about. What the type of experimentation that is happening in the scientific community that is largely unregulated, and the tech industry is unregulated. There's an arms race to the top when it comes to AI and technological development. And of course, you know, that's top of the agenda for America, for President Trump, but worldwide, Saudi Arabia wants to be, and I quote, the AI headquarters of the world by 2030. Vision 2030 is something you really need to look into. And so we know there's a mass technological arms race, but not a lot of guardrails. And when I see something like this happening without limitation, like where does this head? They always talk about it under the guise in this article of helping with disease modeling and drug discovery and mental health assistance. It's always in these really benign terms that they're talking about this development. But what we're really talking about is using AI technology to program human cells at a base. Don't go anywhere. We have a lot to discuss when I get back after this break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to our last segment of the Next Generation. I can't believe it's almost over. The show has flown by. It's been just incredible to cover so many topics today. So please go back and listen, because there's so much for you to be aware of in our busy and changing world. One of which is this topic I just introduced about a new invention of a computer that does not run on silicone, but runs on human skin cells. It's called a biological computer. Alyssa, I'm going to start with you because I know this is a dense, I'm sure if you're listening and you are at all technical, you are making fun of me, and that's okay because we're doing our best. But Alyssa, I would love to just get, your thoughts on this idea of the merging of technology and the human person, programming human cells. I think a entry point way to think of this is even the COVID vaccine, which we've discussed ad nauseum, but how that altered used mRNA DNA to re-alter the way that our bodies and systems work. That's a way that they're saying human cells can be programmed and reprogrammed. And that's a very disturbing development, personally. I personally think, Alyssa.
Yeah, I'm going to admit technology to this scale is something I'm not super familiar with, but just giving it a cursory glance, I think a lot of the questions that I have come down to moral questions and also just practical questions, such as what are the privacy issues regarding this? How is this going to impact cybersecurity if organisms are living? How is that going to impact if there's a malfunction? How is it going to impact how stable the computer is, because living cells are always changing and growing? And also, how is it going to affect ownership rights? If someone is donating their skin cells to build something, do they have ownership over that thing? Is their data going to be kept safe and not be used as some kind of biological weapon? So there are concerns on that front, but also as a moral concern. Oftentimes in human instrumentalization and industrialization, we have to ask the question is, just because I can do something, should I do it? And that's the question I have regarding these biocomputers, because as Christians, we have a high view of the body, that the body is something sacred, that we are supposed to steward it well. And I'm very unsure as to whether or not this delegates human beings and our bodies down to a mere tool that can be used and exploited instead of the sacred gift that it has been given to us by God.
You hit the nail on the head, Alyssa, because when I was reading this article, he was discussing how superior using human biological cells is to synthetic materials, right? That the human cell is so much more complex and intelligent. And our cells, for instance, we get sick, and the fact that our bodies can heal from a cold and a flu, that is intelligent design. We are created as the most complex structure of creation, our very humanity. And when I think about the dignity that we have as being created in the image of God, to say that we're going to allow a man-made creation, it's almost like this idea of the created trying to become the creator. When I think of all of the technological advancements that's going on, that there's this race to just say we're going to have hyper intelligence. We're going to create our own omniscience, like our own unlimited intellect. This is just like a God complex run amok, and it's deeply concerning to me, and what stood out to me about the types of cell, the way that they said humanity is just so superior, is a reason for them to utilize it as a tool. Right. It's dehumanizing what you're alluding to, Alyssa, this idea that because of the complexity of the human cell, the way God designed it, its ability to adapt and learn, and it was even talking about the ability of these cells to pick up on, nuances and things like that, that should be commoditized. They're constantly trying to commoditize humanity. And I just think we as believers need to pay attention. This is an obscure article. Go make a Google alert for AI technological development, and see what they're doing. Anytime they're trying to dehumanize us or commoditize our bodies or the ways that God created us, we should be concerned. The term for this, Richard, by the way, there is transhumanism, merging technology with the human person, and it is on the rise, and we should all become very familiar with what that is, right, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to have a clear mind about the fact that there's going to be arguments that these things do benefit humans in some way, that somehow merging, biology with modern computing can help lead to advances in fighting brain diseases and testing new medicines. So there are going to be benefits that are going to be tied with it. But the question is, do they outweigh the moral costs? Are there things that you can have from this, but prohibit other things that you can get, other benefits you could have from this? I think that it allows us to really explore two important, principles as Christians. The first is that technology ultimately is a gift from God, because we are able to use the tools that He provides to improve our lives. I think that it's interesting. I was having this conversation with my wife about, here we have a baby, and we know that there's so many things that so many temptations to have a baby look at a screen, and here we have the phone on, and what age do we let them use a phone? And we don't want to have our kid become like an iPhone zombie or anything like that. But we wouldn't want to live in a world without the iPhone either. I think it's one of those things where we have the pluses of technology, but we mitigate the downsides of it. Technology should serve people, not replace them. And we should never think that computers can replace human judgment and moral reasoning. Should undermine our God-given status as persons made in His image. And that's a conversation we need to be on the forefront of. But we also need to push back against this idea of technological utopianism. Whenever there's a new advancement, there's this temptation for people to think this is finally going to save us. This is going to make everyone happy, and it's going to reduce all our problems. No, that's not what it's going to do. It's going to be a tool that might have some uses, but I think society is so tempted to think that technology has made religion, has made faith obsolete, and I think we need to have sharp arguments in response to that.
Well said. Well said. Well, Richard, while we have our last couple minutes, go ahead and tell our listeners how they can follow you, like you, support your work.
Sure. Well, I am the host of This American President, a podcast that you can find pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts, Spotify, your podcast app on your phone. So make sure you check it out. And I have a website, richardmlim.com, where I talk about a book project that I'm working on about George Washington and the Founding Fathers. But make sure you check all of that, including my podcast.
Thank you, Richard, for being with us. We always appreciate your perspective. And Alyssa, go ahead and tell our listeners where they can learn more about your perspective and follow your work.
Yeah, I primarily work with Illinois Family Institute. I work with them as obviously the director's assistant. I also work as a writer, and I do social media for them as well. So you can follow us on Instagram at Illinois Family Institute. Follow our webpage as we put out articles every day about relevant topics that not only affect people who live in Illinois, but also we give a broader perspective of how it affects the nation as a whole.
Well, thank y'all so much for being with us today. Don't forget to go to pointofview.net where you can read our articles and more about Kirby's viewpoints. Thank you for being with us. Bye.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.